Good morning, everyone. I hope this works. I just started trying to do a live a couple of times and I was having some technical difficulties, but hopefully it's sorted out now. I think it's going to be okay. So this morning I'm going to mix up the higher hydration beginner bread recipe. So the beginner bread recipe that we created for beginners focuses on the basic essential processes of making sourdough, so that you can practice and master those processes that you need. It leaves out optional processes like cold proofing, auto lease, more advanced processes. The beginner bread recipe, which is linked in the description of this video, is designed to be simple and easy to practice with as a beginner. And then once you sort of master that, then you could start looking at increasing your hydration in order to get sort of a thinner, crispier crust and a more airy inside of your loaf. So for the higher hydration beginner bread recipe, we're going to use 200 grams of starter, 1,000 grams of flour, any blend you like, and 20 grams of salt and 700 grams of water. And then after I'm done mixing up the bread today, I'm going to dehydrate some starter and get my starters refed. So I'll try and keep an eye on the comments here. And if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So my starters were fed yesterday. They have peaked and begun to fall. So they're past peak at the moment. You can use your starter at or after peak. The longer after peak you go, the more sour your bread will be because your starter will have fermented more. So mine has fermented quite a bit. I'm going to get a nice strong sour flavor today, and my starters are actually quite liquid at the moment. So I'm going to be able to just pour them in. One of the things that we always say is that, you know, beginners don't necessarily need to worry so much about being exactly precise all the time. The better bet for them is to really just understand what the essential processes are, what the basics are, and follow those, right? You can use your starter at various times. You can adjust your measurements, everything else. Every little itty bitty detail that comes with sourdough is less important than knowing what the essential processes are. So the essential processes are to have an active starter that is at or after peak, to take your starter and put your water for your recipe in and blend the two together, to add your flour and salt and get them mixed up to a nice shaggy dough. Let your dough rest for about 30 minutes and then begin stretching and folding. So we stretch and fold in order to build strength. So we do a stretch and fold, we let the bread rest for 30 minutes, we repeat the stretch and fold and do that 30 minutes rest and stretch and fold 3 or 4 times. Once you get more experience, you'll start to understand what's happening and what you're trying to do and be able to recognize when your dough is strong enough. But as a beginner, the safe thing to do is just 3 or 4 stretch and folds. And then we're going to transfer our bread into bulk proofing containers, clear, straight-sided, sort of Tupperware style containers. Mark what height they started at, leave them on the counter to bulk proof. Bulk proofing usually takes between 4 and 8 hours, depending on the temp of your home. You're basically just going to watch for the dough to come close to double. So it's going to expand sideways and upwards. Once you get to double, then you're at the point where you can dump your bread, pre-shape it without any water or flour, get it into a nice dough ball shape, let it rest for 30 minutes, flip it over, shape it into your final loaf, score it, and bake it. That's the basic simplified process. Once you've done that, 3 or 7 or 10 or 12 times, and every time your bread's starting to come out consistently, you're getting a good spring, you're getting a good ear, the bread isn't super gummy, then you can start looking at increasing your hydration to reduce the density of the bread. So I've got 200 grams of starter in my bowl. I'm now going to add 700 grams of water. I just use tap water. I'm on a well, which means there is no chlorine in my water, but there is water softener salt in it. My rule of thumb with water is if you would drink it, it's probably fine in your starter. If you wouldn't drink it, then maybe you need to filter it or get some spring water, something along those lines. So I've got 700 grams of water and 200 grams of starter in my bowl, and I'm just going to use a whisk and blend them together until the starter fully dissolves, and we sort of have a nice white, milky looking foamy substance. I like to just give it a really good mix. Make sure the bottom of the bowl is scraped and all of the starter is dissolved. Now we hear people talking about the float test. We don't consider the float test to be accurate for a starter. If you've got lots of air in your starter and you dump it in the water, it's going to float. But if your starter is past peak or has been stirred down, it might not float. So it's not necessarily an accurate test. The most accurate test for a starter is it doubles consistently in the same way after every feed. And it's at least a week old, so it's past all the weird smells that happen during the fermentation process. Your sourdough starter should smell very strong, like sourdough, with a slight alcoholic smell to it. And of course, as you add it into the water and the flour, that sort of gets spread out and isn't so strong in the final bread. So now what I'm going to do is add 1,000 grams of flour, and you can use any blend of flour that you want. If you're a beginner, we recommend that you stay under about 20% whole wheat or sturdier flours like spelt, just because those flours tend to make the dough act a little bit differently. So a good regular all-purpose flour or an unbleached all-purpose flour, an organic all-purpose flour, a bread flour, any of these would work good for about 800 grams, 80% of the flour that you're going to use. And you can split this recipe in two. So instead of 200 grams of starter, 700 grams of water, 1,000 grams of flour, and 20 grams of salt, you can just split it right down the middle. 100 grams of starter, 500 grams of flour, 350 grams of water, and 10 grams of salt. So I've got a little bit of oat flour left. So I'm just going to dump all that's left in this bag into my mix and then top it up to 1,000 with my regular all-purpose flour. We see all the time people wondering if they can use bleached flour. You can. It will totally work. Is it a low quality flour? Sure. You know, like our higher quality flour is theoretically going to give you better bread, maybe, especially if you've got the skill set down. But you should just use what you have. That's what we always recommend. So the oat flour came in at 168 grams. So now I'm just going to top the rest of this up to 1,000 grams with my regular all-purpose flour. So in the description of this video, I've included a link to the beginner bread recipe. If you're ready to advance up to the higher hydration recipe, you can find that recipe in the YouTube channel or comment and I'll paste it for you. I've also included the starter tutorial. So if you're watching and learning, but you don't have a starter yet, we've got a full like day by day, 9-day, here's us making a starter using both cups and a scale. And then we've also got the common starter questions, which is by far the most used tutorial in the Sourdough for Beginners group. I've also got a link to our Sourdough Essentials ebook. So the ebook is 34 pages. It helps you understand what processes are essential, what processes are advanced or optional. How does this work? There's a glossary, there's a starter recipe. It talks about timing. It talks about converting from cups to grams. It's really like a one-stop shop. So costs a couple bucks, but some people really like the book. That's linked as well. So we've got 1,000 grams of flour, and now we're going to add 20 grams of salt, and I just pour it on top. So what I've got is starter and water blended together, flour and salt piled on top. What I'm going to do is just use my spoon on top of the water and flour to sort of blend these two flours and salt that I've put in here. And then I'm going to use my spoon to stir the dough until the flour has absorbed almost all of the water. And then I'll switch to my hand. And while I'm mixing, we can talk about building strength in your bread. So with regular bread, like if you were just using yeast, then you would mix up your dough and then you would knead it, right? And you would keep on kneading it until it became like a nice, smooth, elastic bowl, and then you would let it double. Well, sourdough is very sticky. And it's also, you know, active instant yeast works a lot quicker than sourdough starter does. So we stretch and fold instead of, or in place of, kneading. And when we stretch and fold, what we're doing is a few things. We're getting the flour and the starter to really get mixed up well and combined together. We are starting to build the gluten structure within the bread. But the most important thing that we're doing is we're building strength in the dough. So what happens once you get into this and start doing it, what you're watching for is you've mixed your dough. It's very shaggy. It's messy. You know, you're about to let it sit for 30 minutes. It's not fully blended yet. You can see dry spots, right? You're going to be fine with that. After you do your initial mix, you're going to let it sit for 30 minutes because you know that over the next 3 or 4 stretch and folds, you're going to get that flour blended. But as you stretch and fold, what you'll notice is that the dough starts to do a couple of things. It starts to be smoother and shinier, and it also starts to resist you as you stretch. So at your first stretch, in your first stretch and fold, when you grab that dough and pull it up, it'll come like up above your head and it'll start to tear and it'll do all sorts of things. But even by the 3rd or 4th stretch and fold, in that first stretching and folding process, you'll feel the dough start to resist you, right? Katie says, hi, if my starter is all whole wheat flour, what should I expect to see? It doesn't seem to bubble as much. Let me just open this comment up a little more. And recipes seem to take a little extra water. So sturdier flours like whole wheat and spelt absolutely will absorb up a little bit more water. We recommend, you know, if you're going to use the beginner bread recipe, but try to increase whole wheat, say to 50% or whatever it may be, you might need an extra 10 or 15 grams of water. I'm not sure, Katie, how old your starter is. It could just still be in the fermentation phase. It's normal for a starter. Well, in fact, a starter should take at least a week to activate. It's normal for it to take 2 to 3 weeks. Almost always when we see a starter that's bubbling nicely but not actually rising, the answer that fixes it is that you could increase your flour at feedings and or reduce your water. So for example, if you're doing 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water at your feeding, you might change it to 55 grams of flour and 45 grams of water. Usually a watery, bubbly starter that's not doubling is hungry. Katie says it's really mature. Thank you for answering me. My pleasure, Katie. I'm really happy to help. So if it's a nice mature starter, try to beef it up a little bit by giving it a little bit more flour at feeding. Remember, with a mature starter, you can change the feeding any way you want. You can increase it so that you've got more. If you have a big baking day coming, you can reduce it all the way down to a small amount. Whole wheat starters work, all starters, regardless of the flour you use, essentially do the same thing and can work as well as another. So if you've got any more questions, let me know. I'll keep an eye on that. So what we've got is the dough mixed. And as you can see, it's very sticky, sticking to my hands. It is very shaggy. There's some dry spots of flour, but the idea is that we're just going to leave this like this for 30 minutes and then we'll begin stretching and folding. You'll know your bread is growing strength when you're stretching and folding, when if you just put a tiny bit of water on your hand and do stretching and folding, you don't get this happening. The dough starts to cling to itself rather than to the things around it. LaDonna says, I've made the previous beginner recipe twice now. I had a good ear on only one of the loaves. Is that a scoring issue, or I have to push C more to get these to open, or a process issue? 90% of the time, LaDonna, it's a process issue. The essential processes are sort of need to be followed. Not need to be. I mean, there's lots of different ways to make sourdough. But if you're following the essential processes effectively, then generally you'll start to have your bread turning out consistently the same way every time. If you only had a good ear on one of your loaves and not on the other, it's probably a proofing issue. So it's posted all over the group, but after this live, I'll go into the comments for Donna and I'll respond, and I'll post the bulk proofing success video for you. and I'll show you what we do. So bulk proofing is when your bread goes through its rise process after stretching and folding is done, and it is the most important part of the development of the dough to be ready to cook. So we suggest, with this one I would split it in two, that you put your dough in a clear, straight-sided, you know, inexpensive Tupperware container like this, and mark the height of your dough. And then you're going to be able to see how it rises. If you let your dough rise in a bowl like this, we see people post in the group all the time, my dough isn't rising. And the reality is it probably actually is rising, but what's happening is because the bowl is so big and wide, it's spreading sideways, right? It almost even looks like it might be shrinking because it's going sideways. Sourdough doesn't do that big puffy rise that yeast bread does. It just grows and gets bigger and bubbly and everything else, right? So 9 times out of 10, when we're seeing a dense, gummy loaf or an ear not developing, where the bread comes out and you scored it, but it's sort of like smoothed over and there's no ear left on the bread, it's because the dough wasn't proofed properly. So what we suggest is keep practicing the beginner bread recipe and experiment with where the right rise is. You can let your dough rise all the way to 100% doubled. Another essential process is pre-shaping, where you dump your dough out onto the counter, no flour, no water, use a bench scraper. People laugh at my video. I'll put the pre-shaping video in the comments as well. I don't have a bench scraper and I use a knife, and people are always like, knife. But you're going to start to shape that dough. So if your dough is 100% proofed or even a little overproofed, it's going to be sticky and hard to manage. And if you just start trying to shape it, it's going to stick to everything and it's going to be super frustrating and it probably isn't going to work. So if you use this pre-shaping process, start to build some strength again into this dough and then let it sit and then shape it, then you're on a good track. So with your essential processes, you've mixed the beginner bread recipe, you've done stretching and folding, you have now put your dough into clear straight-sided containers, you've let it bulk proof, now you've dumped it out, you've pre-shaped it, sort of at the same time that you're about to start pre-shaping, your oven is preheating, and then you're going to final shape your bread and score it. Another little trick, and this won't solve the issue if your processes are wrong, right? If you're missing something in your process, or you're mixing something up, or you're not quite doing something correctly, this will not solve the problem, but it might help your bread a little bit, is score your dough, put it in the oven, wait 10 minutes, and then pull it back out again. If it looks like that score line is starting to fuse together instead of creating an ear, take your razor and cut it again, and then pop it back in the oven. That sometimes helps things, but it's not always the issue. Can you explain how our process should change when humidity is higher? That's a great question, Colleen. Generally, warmer, more humid climates, the bulk proofing stage goes a lot faster. So your mix should stay the same, you know what I mean? You might want to play with your hydration, right? The beginner bread recipe is 680 grams of water. The higher hydration is 700. We're only talking about a 20-gram water difference. The other issue is that the beginner bread recipe is 120 grams of starter, whereas the higher hydration is 200 grams of starter. So if you're trying to sort of control your bread in a humid or hot temperature, you might reduce the amount of starter that you're using by 20 to 50 grams, perhaps reduce the amount of water that you're using, or you might just keep that same amount of starter, even go for a really high hydration bread, like 75 or 80% hydration, but keep a really close eye on it. And the bulk proofing containers are really going to help, because when your dough is marked, and if you watch the video when I posted in the links, when your dough is marked, it's sort of like jagged and it's not touching here, you'll be able to see that it expanded outwards to the edge of the container and upwards. So you want your container to be just about double the size of your dough. So this ends up being 2 1,000-gram loaves of bread, and these are 8 cups. I'm in Canada, so it says 1.89 liters, which I suspect is close to 2 quarts, but I don't totally speak American measurements. Okay, so this has been mixed. It's just sitting and resting and waiting for that 30 minutes to pass. So in the meantime, while I'm waiting for that to sit for 20 or 30 minutes before I start doing the first stretch and fold, what I'm going to do is take care of my starters. I'm going to dehydrate a bunch of mama. So there's lots of people who want to know how to dehydrate some starter. It's really easy. So I'm just going to take a few pieces of parchment paper like this. And I'm going to put my starter onto these pieces of parchment paper, spread it as thin as I can, and then I'm just going to sit them in like sort of a warm, dry place. So some people have dehydrators, some people don't. Nobody touches the stove in my house, so I'm just actually going to sit these in the stove with the light on, and it'll help them. They dry fully in about 24 to 30 hours. Colleen says, it got warmer and more humid where I live recently. I noticed my dough is more wet. 100%, Colleen, that absolutely will happen, and it'll rise faster. So consider maybe just reducing your hydration by 10 or 15 grams of water and expecting your bulk proofing time. So I was making bread in the summer, and you know, I live in Ontario, Canada. It's an extremely humid climate in the summer. I'm on the lake, like right next to the water. I could practically jump off my back deck into the water. It's humid. And when I was doing that, the beginner bread recipe was working great for me at the 680 grams, and my dough was bulk proofing in like under 4 hours. I almost couldn't leave when it started bulk proofing because it would overproof on me. Now it's winter. We're at like -5 to -15 degrees Celsius, which is like really cold. And it gets very dry here in the winter. So just one climate to the next. And I'm finding that my dough is coming out a little bit denser. I'm getting some more gummy loaves with the lower hydration. So out of necessity, I've increased the hydration. And my rise time is taking more like 5 to 6 hours instead of 4. So everybody's kitchen is different. Everybody's circumstance is different. And the thing about sourdough is there's lots of learning out there. There's lots of tutorials. But ultimately, at some point, you have to start experimenting with your own environment and find what works for you. So our philosophy in this group and on this page is that we can teach you what the essential processes are. We can sort of debunk some of the myths. We can reassure you. We can provide you with all the recipes that you need. But ultimately, once you're done practicing those essential processes, you are going to need to finally make the adjustments that work for you. The temperature and time that you bake your bread is a perfect example. So my oven only goes to 450 degrees. So the 500 degree preheat just isn't an option for me. So I cook my bread at 450 degrees the whole time. And people always ask me, well, how do I cook my bread? The answer is you cook your bread the way that your oven works best, right? So if you've got a very hot oven, you might preheat at 500 degrees, drop your temp down to 450 or 425, and keep an eye on it. The best way to know your bread is done is to use like a cheap meat thermometer, an internal thermometer, and look for a 205 degree temp. A dough that is underproofed might not ever brown. Usually if you're having trouble getting your dough to look cooked, it's a good indicator that you're underproofed. So I'll just show you. What I'm doing is dehydrating some of my starter. So I've just taken some parchment paper and spread it nice and thin. And like I said, these are just going to sit in my oven until they're fully dried out. And then what I end up with is these sort of dried out starter flakes. And I eventually put them in a blender and turn them into almost a powder. This starter is named Mama. She's in all of my my tutorials, and some people just want to skip making their own starter and get a dehydrated one and reactivate it. So I've always got lots of dehydrated starter happening for people who grab those off of Etsy. So just spread this on. This might be a little bit much for this paper. And then once we're done getting this ready to dehydrate, I'll refeed my starter. So a lot of people ask, you know, I've got a mature starter, I know how to bake, now what do I do with my starter? There's a few options, well there's lots of options, but there's a couple of good ways to manage your starter once it's active and you've started baking. If you're a frequent baker, if you're baking 3 to 4 or 5 times a week, then your best bet is just to feed your starter daily and keep it on the counter. So when you're doing it that way, you might end up with some discards. So if, for example, today's the day you need to feed, but you're not going to bake, then you would just discard some of your starter into a discard jar that you keep in the fridge and feed your starter. The discard that you create from your starter should be used up within 2 weeks, but once you put it into the fridge in a nice tightly sealed jar, it doesn't need to be fed anymore. And you can use it in recipes like discard chocolate chip recipes and, you know, discard sandwich bread, cinnamon buns. I mean, the discard recipes are awesome. There's actually lots of people in the group who never ever make bread and just make discard recipes. So I'll also post all of my favorite discard tutorials in the comments of this video. I'm starting to get a whole big collection of stuff to post, but these videos, when I do them live, stay up forever. So you'll be able to come back and look at them. I think if you, once it's posted, click the top 3 buttons on the right, you might be able to save it and then come back for whatever it was that you're looking for. So just add a little bit of starter to this one and we'll spread it out. So dehydrating is pretty easy, right? The thinner you spread it, the faster it's going to dry. Sometimes I'll let it sit for 12 hours and then I'll go check it. And if there's spots that are seeming pretty wet, then I'll just re-spread them again. The biggest thing is that you want to just make sure that you keep it nice and dry in sort of a fairly warm environment until it dries and gets all crusty and crackly, and then you want to make sure that you store it in a tightly sealed container. So a good reason for dehydrating your starter is as like an insurance policy. So God forbid, if anything were to happen to your starter and it molded or whatever it may be, then you might be able to, well, you would have this backup there. So I recommend everybody dehydrate at least 50 grams of starter at some point just to have as an insurance policy. Good morning, Kim. I'm happy you're here. So everybody who's watching, Kim Mecca is in the comments right now. She is one of our moderators for the group. She knows sourdough. She knows how to help. So I can see that she's actually watching the comments that are coming in. She's responding to Colleen because Kim, lucky girl, lives in Florida and is used to a humid temperature. Kim, I am just dreaming about Florida right now. I was just saying to my husband yesterday that we might be able to skip our awful Canadian climate in March this year and head down to Palm Coast, where we frequently go visit. I don't know if that's anywhere close to you, Kim, but if it is, then we definitely have to meet up and have a hug. Cool. Yeah, so Kim and Colleen are chatting. So the Sourdough for Beginners group, I started making sourdough. I started sharing my starter with friends. You know, I posted it on Marketplace. Local people started buying it. And then as soon as the starters started getting distributed out into the world, people started to have lots of questions about what they were going to do. So I created the Sourdough for Beginners group as a place where I could just post like how to make bread, how to maintain your starter, you know, some common questions that were coming up in one place and not have to keep texting it to people. So I was thinking like, oh, you know, this group's going to have 100 people in it or whatever it may be. And now it's at something like 450,000 members. You know, the great thing about the group is it's a forum. So Colleen, who is in Louisiana, can connect with Kim, who is in Florida and has a similar climate. So that's what's really great about the group. And then we have a sister page, same name, Sourdough for Beginners, but it's a page instead of a group. And the way the page works is that only the person who owns the page can post there. So all of our tutorials are on the page. So if you want to come into the forum and get some specific questions answered and interact with people, you do that on the group. If you just want to find tutorials, then you come follow the page and find them there. You're welcome, Colleen. Yes, hugs, Kim. And thank you so much for being in here. So if anybody's got any questions, absolutely ask. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to feed my starters. And then I'm going to go back to how we maintain our starters, because I talked about what we would do if you're a frequent baker. And then I'll show you the first stretch and fold on this dough. Rosie says, I've never known you could dehydrate, so this was awesome to find. Thank you. You're welcome, Rosie. Everybody should dehydrate a little bit of starter as a backup plan. I mean, if we love these things and care for them and keep them in a container with this tightly sealed lid, our starter shouldn't mold. It shouldn't. But things happen, and if you've got dehydrated backup starter, then rather than having to start all over again, you can just take your starter that you loved and, you know, rehydrate it, reactivate it, and you're good to go. So caring for our starters. So one way is to keep your starter on the counter, feed it every day, and every day you need to discard it. So you're either going to discard it into a bread recipe or into a discard jar that you store in the fridge and use in discard recipes. If you're a once a week baker, a Saturday baker, then you can put it into the fridge one of two ways. You can put it into the fridge fed or unfed. So someone like me who might not bake for a week now, I could actually just take these starters exactly the way they are and stick them in the fridge and then pull them out the night before I bake, 4 to 12 hours before I bake. And remember that if you know when your starter peaks, if your starter peaks at 4 hours and you want to use your starter at peak, then time your feeding for your baking. But you can use your starter past peak, and the longer past peak it goes, the more sour your bread is. So me, I just feed my starter before bed and bake with it in the morning. Today I've got a very strong smell, so I'm going to have very sour dough. I like it that way, so we're all good to go. The other option is that you can put it in the fridge fed. So what I usually do is I will feed my starter, let it rise on the counter, and pop it in my fridge risen. And if I bake within a day or two, I'll actually pull it straight out of the fridge and use it without refeeding it again. If it's a week or more before I bake, I might wait until, I might refeed it first just to beef it back up again. So if it started to go really liquidy in the fridge, I might discard and feed it and then use it before baking. So yeah, and then Kim also, so some people are asking questions about dehydrating. Colleen, I do dehydrate at or after peak, as close to peak as possible. Kim is answering how to restart or rehydrate a starter. Kim, somewhere there's like a picture that I post with those rehydration instructions. I don't know if you have them, but if you don't, I'll reply to your comment after the live and post that. It's just like a little infographic on how to rehydrate a starter. And it is based on 15 grams, but it's a great idea to dehydrate, you know, just a bunch. So I'm going to refeed my starters. So I used a lot of this one. I've only got about 50 grams left in there, and I didn't use very much of this one. My starters are established and strong enough now that I sort of change my feeding amounts every day. You know, I just adjust. So I'm going to feed this one that still has lots in it, 30 grams each of flour and water. And I'm going to feed this one that doesn't have much left in it, 75 grams each of flour and water. So I'm just going to pop my starter on the scale, get it to tare to 0 so it's ignoring the weight of the jar. And I'm going to put about 30 grams of flour in here. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exact. You just want to try to make sure that you've got either the same amount of flour and water or slightly more flour and water. If you haven't made a starter yet, or if you're operating in cups instead of with a scale, the links in the description of this video have the cups and quarter cups. So this ended up being 35 grams. So I'll add 35 grams of water. So I'll just tare back to 0. And there we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix this up. It's nice and thick right now. As it eats through its flour, it's normal for it to get thin and liquidy. This one's actually still kind of looking a little bit liquidy, so I'm going to give it a little bit more flour. Remember that you can control the consistency of your starter. Nothing has to be exact. It's great to be consistent. It's a really good idea to be consistent, but at the same time, you really need to pay attention to what your starter is doing. Christine says, 1 month beginner from Louisiana, only using discard recipes so far. I'm confused about the timeline, when to start the feeding to eventually bake in the morning. Great question, Christine. I actually have a little video about timing. I'll paste that for you. I feed my starter before bed and mix early in the morning, usually 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. Usually a mature starter takes about 4 hours or 5 hours to double, but there are starters that take much longer. I would think in Louisiana with your warm climate, your starter's probably going to peak within 4 hours. So you've got a couple of options. You can either get up early in the morning and feed your starter and wait for it to peak and mix with it, or you can feed it the night before and mix with it in the morning. It'll be past peak at that point. You'll get a stronger sour taste, but some people like that. Yeah, Colleen's in Louisiana too. We were just actually talking to her about her climate. You might want to rewind and see that part. Okay, so that one's mixed. My jars are getting to the point. So some people change their jar every day. I do not. I change my jar every 4 to 6 weeks, but I'll show you. This one is starting to get very crusty, and my lid, I will show you, it's starting to get quite crusty. So usually just when it starts to build up and get really crusty, that's when I'll just dump my starters into a fresh jar and clean these ones. So I'm going to do 75 grams of flour on here. Hi Rosie, I'm just using regular all-purpose flour, not unbleached. That tends to be a debate in the group. Is some people genuinely believe that you cannot use bleached all-purpose flour, and I'm here to say you guys are watching me live on video using these starters and making bread from them and everything else, and they're working perfectly. So regular all-purpose flour absolutely does work. So we are going to give this 75 grams of water because I gave it 75 grams of flour. So I always say, people are like, well, how much do I feed my starter? Usually I put back in what I took out, but you can adjust your starter based on what you need. So if you kind of always want to stay over a 25 or 50 gram base of starter. You want to make sure you never run out, right? So for me, I used 200 grams out of this one today. I just refed it 150, but that's because I have 2 starters, and I don't plan to dehydrate any starter for quite some time, so I don't need that extra. So I usually kind of set my starters up with their feedings for what I know is coming next. So my next bake, I'm probably going to only need 200 grams total. So I might feed them a little bit less than I took out. But in general, as a rule, just feed what you took out of the starter. Okay, so my starters are refed, and my starters are going to sit on the counter until they double, which will be 3 or 4 or 5 hours from now. And then they're going to get popped in the fridge at peak, and then I'll probably pull them out and bake with them again tomorrow. And I'll take a look at them. If they're really watery and alcohol smelling, then I'll discard and feed them before I bake. But if they're just nice and thick and look lovely and exciting to bake with, I might not feed them. I might just bake with them straight out of the fridge. So I will do some stretching and folding. Rosie says, okay, I use King Arthur and rotate organic light rye. Yeah. Use the flour you've got. Like if you go back to the beginning of this live, I put oat flour in my bread today because I had a little bit left and wanted to use it up. It works. So here's our mix that we made. Let me just get it closer to you. It is looking dry and shaggy and messy and bumpy and not holding together. So we're going to do our first stretch and fold. So I'm going to get my hand just a little bit wet. So I've got sort of not drenched, but I've got all the way down, and I'm going to show you what happens with the stretch and fold, even with it, like, so number one, when you do the stretch and fold process 3 to 4 times, you're building lots of strength, but even within each specific stretch and fold, you'll start to see changes in the dough. So when I do this first stretch, I'm going to over exaggerate. You don't do this, but I'm going to show you how high this dough will come and how it will rip and fall apart. So with this first one, as I pull, see, it will do this, right? Normally wouldn't do that. Normally you would just go underneath and come like this. But the point is that I'm showing you that when you first start stretching and folding, there's no strength in the dough, or very little strength in the dough. It tears, it's sticky, it doesn't stay together, but you will notice that it's sticking to my hands less than it was when I first mixed it. So for this first stretch and fold, I'm going to, you know, go around north, south, east, west, just sort of start to move the dough around and encourage it to start holding together, right? Now, if you look at the dough, compared to right before I stretch and fold it, it's already a little smoother, but it's still sticky, right? It still would come apart if you grabbed it. The stretching and folding process, we want to do that 3 or 4 times until it starts to be a ball of dough. So by the time I go to put my dough into my bulk proofing container, there will be enough strength in the dough that so normally what I do is I do my last stretch and fold, the 4th stretch and fold, and then once it's stretched and fold, then I'll separate the dough. Well, you should be able to hold this big dough and twist it and rip it into 2 balls to go into your bulk proofing containers, but it should be really hard. Like, you should really have to kind of fight with it, and it'll stay together and not be sticky. So then what I do is I just sort of plunk them into the bulk proofing containers, give them a quick stretch and fold, and then squish them down as much as I can. And then I just take like a Sharpie, and I'll like draw, you know, like it might not be touching over here, so I'll show myself where the voids are and everything else, and then I can just watch it. Cool. Kim is posting things, so thanks, Kim. I'm so glad you're here. It's awesome. All right, so if anybody else has any questions, this will get posted. Post them in the comments. We'll keep on answering. And, you know, I always try to get back to show the baking process if I can. We'll see how today goes. It's Monday. What I'm going to do, let me show you my my cold proofing containers and just quickly talk about the difference between bulk proofing and cold proofing and how one is essential and one is optional and what we recommend beginners do. Bear with me just for a sec. So I ordered these off of Amazon. They're silicone bannetons, and I also got this reusable shower cap. I thought it was a 5-pack, and I was wrong. It was only 1, so now I need another. But cold proofing. So bulk proofing happens after stretching and folding and before pre-shaping and shaping. It needs to happen in a warm environment, not warm, but on your counter is 90% of the time fine. Sometimes if you put your dough, when it's bulk proofing, into the oven with the light on, it's too hot and it'll sort of mess it up. So I really encourage you to try to do it on the counter if you can, unless your house is freezing. And then, you know, you could use your stove with the light on. There's also dough proofing boxes. They're like $20 and they're like this big and they plug in and they kind of give like a nice even heat to your dough. So I'll also paste those. But cold proofing happens after pre-shaping and shaping, but before scoring and baking. It's an optional process. Cold proofing happens in the fridge. Your dough can go into the fridge basically all the way up to 36. Some people stretch it to 48 hours, but it sits there in the fridge. It does expand a little bit more. It does rise a little bit, but more importantly, it just continues to build that gluten structure. So one way to get a sour flavor in your bread is to use your starter past peak. Another way to build more flavor in your bread is to allow it to cold proof. I rarely cold proof. I almost always need my bread. But in this case, I still have a little bit of bread left over. I only really need 1 loaf right now. So today, when the bulk proofing process is done, I'm going to bake one and put the other in the banneton. So I bought these off Amazon. They were super inexpensive. It came with two. So it came with this round one, and it came with this oval one. And I actually did a live the other day. It's posted on the page. And in the cover photo of the live, you can see my little one with me. We made discard pancakes, but we also took a loaf out of these. So I've only used this one once so far, but these are working amazing. They put this really pretty lines on your bread. They make it really nice for scoring. So today I'm going to try putting my bread in this. And then the shower cap is for covering the banneton. So theoretically, and I haven't really tested it too much, but theoretically I'm going to have my dough in this banneton. Oh, and by the way, I didn't have to put any parchment in or anything. I just coated the banneton with a little bit of flour. But theoretically, check it out. So for a couple bucks, I got this shower curtain. I thought I was buying disposable ones. I don't know why, but I got this one, so I'm going to need to order another, but I'm excited to try this. So if I can, I'll try to get back on later and show the bread going into this. Oh, Kim, you found the rehydration image. Thank you. Guys, the mods in this group, if you ever encounter them, their names are Barb Frood, Terry Pepper, Tammy Susowitz, Kim Mecca. You'll see a lot of Rick Hopper in there. There's also Cindy Ford and Jason Hopper. These guys are like in the group, trying to get to you, trying to help you, trying to moderate, trying to make sure that everyone's being kind and friendly and relevant within the group. They have an admin chat. We're always in there talking and learning and deciding how to deal with things. If you see Kim or Tammy or Terry or Barb or Rick or Cindy or Jason, be sure to say thank you, because they just love this group and do such a good job. Okay, so I'll wrap it up for today. I'm going to stretch and fold this 3 more times. I'm going to get it into bulk proofing containers. And then hopefully, if my day works out, I'll pop back on later and I'll show the pre-shaping process and the shaping process for a loaf of bread that's going to go straight into the oven. And I'll also show preparing the bannetons and getting a loaf of bread ready for cold proofing. Check the description of the video. There's really good tutorials there. Focus on mastering the essential processes, the basics, practice those. You might want the ebook. There's videos also about the essential processes on our YouTube channel. Just do those things, and I promise you, you're going to get to a good loaf of bread. So thanks all of you for being there. Thanks for all the awesome comments. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you, Kim, so much. And hopefully we'll see you all, let's say, I will be done stretching and folding by about noon. It might be 5 o'clock or so. I'll try and pop back on and get some bread baked. So talk to you soon. Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. Bye for now.